Sometimes the most broken souls find each other in the most unlikely places. When we abandon hope, life has a way of showing us that second chances come in forms we never expect. High in the Colorado Rockies during the winter of 1886, Jonas Cutter found a dying horse left behind by hunters who had moved on. The weathered cowboy was 58 and haunted by his own failures. Most men would have walked away, but Jonas saw something in those dying eyes. He built a shelter from fallen pine and stayed through the blizzards. Week after week, he tended the animal's wounds and hauled feed up the mountain. As the bond between man and beast grew stronger, both began to heal in ways neither had imagined. But could one broken cowboy really save a dying horse when he couldn't save the family he'd lost years before? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jonas Cutter's worn leather gloves had seen more than their share of hard winters, but nothing quite like the one that gripped the Colorado Rockies in 1886. The leather was cracked and stained dark from years of honest work, each crease telling a story of cattle branded, fences mended, and lives lived close to the bone. Now, as he pulled them tight against the bitter morning air, they seemed to carry the weight of all his failures, along with the promise of redemption that had brought him to this God-forsaken peak. The camp he'd built wasn't much to look at: a lean-to fashioned from deadfall pine and chinked with moss, a fire ring blackened by countless lonely meals, and a rope corral that hadn't held livestock in months. But it was home, or as close to home as Jonas figured he deserved. 5 years of drifting had brought him here, to this high country, where a man could disappear into the silence and forget, for a while, the sound of his own name spoken with disappointment. In his vest pocket, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, Jonas carried a faded daguerreotype of his wife Sarah and their daughter Emma. The photograph was cracked down the middle, splitting Emma's face in two, but Jonas couldn't bring himself to leave it behind or throw it away. Sometimes, when the whiskey was gone and the fire burned low, he'd take it out and trace the crack with one weathered finger, remembering how the photographer had insisted they all hold perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. Emma had been 7 then, all bright eyes and copper curls, squirming in her Sunday dress while Sarah kept a gentle hand on her shoulder. That was before the typhoid came through Cedar Ridge like the angel of death, taking the young and the innocent while leaving men like Jonas to carry their grief up into the mountains where no one could see them break. The town of Cedar Ridge sprawled along the valley floor, some 3,000 feet below Jonas's current perch. Its wood-frame buildings and muddy streets, a testament to mankind's stubborn refusal to let nature have the last word. On clear days, when the mountain air was thin and sharp as broken glass, Jonas could make out the smoke rising from a dozen chimneys and the tiny figures of people going about their business. They looked like ants from up here, scurrying with purpose he could no longer fathom. Once a month, when his supplies ran low and the solitude grew too heavy, even for his broad shoulders, Jonas would make the long ride down to Cedar Ridge. The journey took the better part of a day, switchbacking down game trails that would make a mountain goat think twice. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Jasper, had learned to pick his way carefully over the loose shale and around the deadfalls that winter storms brought down with alarming regularity. The people of Cedar Ridge knew Jonas Cutter, though they weren't quite sure what to make of him. He'd been the foreman at the Rocking Tea Ranch for 12 years before tragedy struck, known throughout the valley as a man who could gentle the wildest bronco and doctor any animal that drew breath. Children used to follow him around the ranch, watching in wonder as he wrapped a broken wing or coaxed medicine down a sick calf's throat. His hands, large and scarred from decades of hard use, could be gentler than a mother's touch when the situation called for it. But that was before the fever, before the guilt, before the long nights when he'd wake up, reaching for Sarah's warmth and finding only cold sheets and emptiness. Doc Mackenzie understood, or came as close to understanding as any man could. The town physician was pushing 70 himself, his own hands gnarled with arthritis, but still steady enough to birth babies and close wounds. When Jonas made his monthly visits, Doc would sometimes invite him for coffee and conversation that danced around the edges of grief without ever naming it directly. "You look thinner each time I see you," Doc had said during Jonas's last visit in December. "Mountain air's fine for the lungs, but a man needs more than pine nuts and rabbit meat to keep body and soul together." Jonas had nodded and changed the subject, as he always did. Some wounds ran too deep for Doc Mackenzie's medicines, though the old physician seemed to understand that too. Mary Sullivan ran the general store with the efficiency of a drill sergeant and the heart of a saint. She was a widow herself, her husband lost to a mine collapse 3 winters back, and she recognized the particular brand of loneliness that Jonas carried like a stone in his chest. She never asked questions when he bought supplies for one, never commented on the way his clothes hung loose or how his eyes seemed to look through her rather than at her. Instead, she'd pack his provisions with extra care and slip in small luxuries, a stick of peppermint candy, a newspaper from Denver, sometimes a jar of her famous apple preserves. "The high country's no place to spend Christmas," she'd said the last time he'd come down, her Irish accent still thick after 20 years in Colorado. "Father O'Brien's planning a fine service, and Mrs. Henderson always makes enough goose to feed half the territory." Jonas had thanked her kindly and declined, as she'd known he would. But the invitation mattered, and they both understood that too. Father O'Brien was new to Cedar Ridge, sent by the diocese to tend a flock that was more scattered than gathered. He was young, perhaps 30, with the kind of earnest faith that hadn't yet been tempered by too much human suffering. The priest made a point of greeting Jonas whenever their paths crossed, treating him with the same dignity he showed the banker and the mayor. There was something in his eyes that suggested he'd known loss himself, though he never spoke of it directly. "God works in mysterious ways," Father O'Brien had said during their last encounter, watching Jonas load supplies into his saddlebags. "Sometimes his mercy comes in forms we don't expect." Jonas had tipped his hat and ridden away without comment, but the words had stuck with him during the long climb back to his mountain camp. Now, pulling on those worn leather gloves in the pre-dawn darkness, he wondered if the young priest might have been talking about something more than divine providence. The routine of his days had settled into a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. Wake before dawn to stoke the fire and boil coffee strong enough to strip paint. Check the snares he'd set for rabbits and ptarmigan, though game was scarce this high up and this late in the winter. Mend gear, chop firewood, and watch the sky for signs of the next storm. In the evenings, when the work was done and the silence pressed down like a physical weight, Jonas would sometimes talk to Jasper about things that didn't seem to matter to anyone else anymore. "Think we might see spring this year, old boy?" he'd say, rubbing the gelding's neck while doling out precious oats. "Or are we just going to freeze solid up here and let the ravens pick our bones?" Jasper would snort and nicker, as if he understood that the question wasn't really about weather at all. The guilt lived in Jonas's chest like a tumor, growing heavier with each passing day. He should have been there when the fever came. Should have recognized the signs earlier, gotten the medicine sooner, done something more than stand helplessly by while the two people who mattered most slipped away from him one labored breath at a time. Sarah had died first, her fever spiking in the dark, hours before dawn, while Jonas held her hand and promised things he couldn't deliver. Emma had lasted 3 more days, calling for her mama and asking why her papa looked so sad. The doctor had done what he could, but typhoid was a merciless killer in those days. It took who it wanted and left the rest to pick up the pieces. Jonas had buried his wife and daughter side by side in the Cedar Ridge cemetery, under a pair of matching headstones that said too little about 2 lives that had meant everything. Then he'd sold the ranch, bought supplies, and ridden up into the high country, where a man could disappear into his grief without anyone asking uncomfortable questions about why he hadn't been strong enough to save the people who counted on him. 5 winters had passed since then, each one harder than the last. Jonas, aged in dog years, his dark hair going silver at the temples, and deep lines carving themselves around his eyes. He'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, and gained a hollow look that no amount of mountain air could cure. Sometimes he caught his reflection in still water and barely recognized the man looking back at him. But the mountains had been kind in their austere way. They'd given him solitude when he needed it most, and silence when words failed completely. They'd taught him that survival was simpler than he'd imagined, just a matter of staying warm, staying fed, and staying one step ahead of the storms that could kill a man who wasn't paying attention. The high country demanded respect, but it didn't judge. It simply was, in all its harsh and terrible beauty. Now, as Jonas prepared for another day in his self-imposed exile, he had no way of knowing that everything was about to change. Somewhere higher up the mountain, in a place where even the hardiest pines gave up their hold on life, a magnificent horse lay dying in the snow. The animal had been strong once, bred for speed and endurance, but the hunters who'd brought him this far had abandoned him when his usefulness ended. They'd taken what they needed and left the rest to the mercy of a mountain that showed precious little mercy to anything. Jonas finished his morning coffee and kicked snow over the fire. Jasper stood waiting by the rope corral, his breath steaming in the cold air. It was time to check the trap lines, though Jonas held little hope of finding anything worth eating. Game was scarce, winter was tightening its grip, and a man could starve to death waiting for Providence to provide. But Providence, as Father O'Brien might have said, sometimes came in forms that men didn't expect. High above Jonas's camp, where the wind scoured the rocks clean and the snow lay deep enough to bury a grown man, something was waiting that would change the course of 2 lives forever. Jonas pulled his hat low against the wind and swung into the saddle. Another day in paradise, as Sarah used to say when the work was hard and the money was tight. Another day to survive and another night to get through. He had no way of knowing that before the sun set on this particular day, he'd find something worth living for again. The broken horseshoe lay half buried in the snow like a black crescent moon, its iron surface scarred and twisted from abuse. Jonas dismounted from Jasper and crouched beside it, his experienced eye taking in the crude nail holes and rough edges that spoke of hasty work and careless handling. This wasn't the product of any respectable blacksmith, more likely hammered out over a campfire by men who cared more about function than craftsmanship. He'd been following the trapline for 2 hours, finding nothing but empty snares and the scattered remains of some small creature that had provided a meal for the ravens. The morning had started clear, but clouds were building on the western peaks, promising another storm before nightfall. Jonas had planned to check the last 3 snares and head back to camp before the weather turned, but the horseshoe changed everything. Fresh tracks pressed deep into the snow told a story Jonas could read like scripture. A hunting party, maybe 4 or 5 men, had passed this way recently within the last day or 2, judging by the crisp edges of the hoofprints. They'd been moving fast, probably running low on supplies and eager to get back to civilization before the next blizzard hit. But something had gone wrong. The tracks showed where they'd stopped, milled around in confusion, and then continued down the mountain with 1 less horse than they'd started with. Jonas followed the trail up the slope, Jasper picking his way carefully through the deepening snow. The wind picked up as they climbed, sending icy crystals stinging against Jonas's face and making Jasper's ears swivel nervously. Whatever they were following, it hadn't gone much farther. He found the horse in a shallow depression between 2 massive granite boulders, almost invisible beneath a blanket of snow that had drifted over the still form during the night. At first glance, Jonas thought the animal was dead, just another casualty of the high country's unforgiving nature. But as he approached, something made him pause and look more carefully. The horse was magnificent, even in its current state, a stallion, probably 5 or 6 years old, with the kind of deep chest and powerful hindquarters that spoke of good breeding and careful training. His coat was dark bay, almost black, with white markings on his face and legs that had once been groomed to perfection. Even half buried in snow and near death, there was something noble about the way he lay, head up and ears forward, as if he was still fighting to survive. Jonas knelt beside the horse and brushed snow from the animal's face. Dark eyes, dulled with pain and exhaustion, fixed on him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. The horse was conscious, aware, and very much alive despite everything working against him. His nostrils flared as he caught Jonas's scent, and one ear twitched forward in what might have been recognition not of the man himself, but of the kind of man he was. "Easy there, big fellow," Jonas murmured, his voice gentle as a prayer. "Let's see what those bastards did to you." The damage was worse than he'd first thought. The horse's right front leg was badly injured, the cannon bone possibly fractured, and the flesh torn by what looked like barbed wire. Blood had frozen in dark streaks down the leg, and the hoof hung at an unnatural angle that made Jonas's stomach clench with sympathy. Worse, the animal was clearly suffering from exhaustion and exposure. His breathing was shallow and labored, his body trembling with more than just cold. Around the horse, scattered in the snow, Jonas found the evidence of abandonment that made his jaw tighten with anger. Empty grain sacks, torn and discarded. A broken bridle, its leather cracked and worthless. The remains of a pack saddle that had been cut away and left to rot. The hunting party had taken what they needed, food, ammunition, anything of value, and left the horse to die when he could no longer carry their burdens. Jonas had seen enough cruelty in his 58 years to know that men could be capable of terrible things when survival was at stake. But this felt different, more calculated. They could have put the horse out of his misery before they left. A single bullet would have been a mercy compared to leaving him to freeze and starve in the mountains. Instead, they'd chosen the coward's way out, telling themselves the horse might somehow survive, while knowing damn well he wouldn't. The practical voice in Jonas's head spoke up with cold logic. The horse was dying, probably beyond help even if he'd had a proper veterinary hospital at his disposal. The humane thing would be to end his suffering quickly and get back to camp before the storm hit. He had his revolver, and one clean shot would settle the matter without prolonging the agony. But as Jonas looked into those dark eyes, something deeper stirred in his chest. Maybe it was the way the horse had lifted his head when Jonas approached, as if he still believed rescue was possible. Maybe it was the memory of another creature left to die alone, 5 years ago, in a bedroom that smelled of carbolic acid and broken dreams. Or maybe it was simply the recognition of one abandoned soul by another. "You're not giving up, are you?" Jonas said softly, running his hand along the horse's neck. "Still fighting, even when everything's stacked against you." The horse nickered weakly, a sound that was part greeting and part plea. It was a sound Jonas hadn't heard in years, the kind of communication that passed between man and animal when words fell short. In that moment, he made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. He was going to try. The first priority was shelter. The depression between the boulders provided some protection from the wind, but it wouldn't be enough if the storm turned serious. Jonas scrambled up the slope, gathering armfuls of deadfall pine and dragging them back to create a windbreak. The work was hard at this altitude, and he found himself breathing heavily after just a few minutes of effort. But the horse watched his every movement with what might have been hope, and that was enough to keep Jonas moving. Using his rope and some broken branches, Jonas fashioned a crude lean-to that would shed the worst of the wind and snow. It wasn't much, but it would have to do until he could build something more substantial. The horse seemed to understand what was happening and made a feeble attempt to shift closer to the shelter, though the effort clearly cost him. Next came the matter of warmth. Jonas had brought his bedroll and an extra blanket, intended for his own use during the long ride back to camp. Now he spread them over the horse's body, tucking the edges down to trap what heat the animal could still generate. It wasn't enough. Nothing would be enough without proper medical attention, but it was a start. The snow was falling harder now, fat flakes that stuck to everything they touched and promised a long, bitter night ahead. Jonas looked up at the darkening sky and calculated his options. He could try to make it back to his own camp before the storm hit, but that would mean leaving the horse alone again. By morning, if the blizzard was as bad as it looked, there might be nothing left to save. Or he could stay, share his meager supplies, tend the horse through the night, and hope they both lived to see another dawn. It was the kind of decision that could get a man killed, the sort of noble stupidity that Sarah used to tease him about when he brought home every stray dog and wounded bird he came across. But as Jonas looked down at the horse, at the way he kept his head up despite the pain, at the trust in those dark eyes, the choice was already made. He'd failed to save the people who mattered most to him. Maybe, just maybe, he could save this one magnificent creature who'd been thrown away like garbage by men who should have known better. "Looks like we're in this together," Jonas said, settling down beside the horse as the snow continued to fall. "Hope you're tougher than you look, because it's going to be a long night." The wind howled through the rocks above them, carrying with it the promise of the kind of storm that could bury a man and horse both beneath 10 feet of snow. But in the small shelter Jonas had built, two broken souls found something they'd both been lacking for far too long. They were no longer alone. Dawn broke cold and clear, the storm having blown itself out sometime before midnight. Jonas woke to find himself pressed against the horse's warm flank, his makeshift splint still holding the injured leg steady. The splint was a crude thing, fashioned from strips of pine bark and pieces of his own flannel shirt. But it had done its job through the long night. Both man and beast had survived, though Jonas wasn't sure which of them had been in more danger of freezing. The horse was awake too, his dark eyes more alert than they'd been the previous evening. When Jonas stirred, the animal lifted his head and nickered softly, a sound that warmed Jonas more than the weak morning sun ever could. It was the sound of trust, of hope, of a creature that understood he was no longer alone in his struggle. "Morning, big fellow," Jonas murmured, running his hand along the horse's neck. The animal's coat was rough and matted, but Jonas could feel the power that lay beneath the kind of strength that came from good bloodlines and careful training. "How are we feeling today?" The horse's response was to try shifting his weight, testing the injured leg with careful deliberation. Pain flickered across his features, but there was determination there too. This was not an animal ready to give up, and that stubborn will to survive sparked something similar in Jonas's chest. The immediate need was for better shelter. The lean-to Jonas had thrown together in the darkness had kept them alive, but it wouldn't suffice for any extended stay. If they were going to have a real chance, Jonas needed to build something that could withstand the mountain weather and provide proper protection for a healing horse. He spent the morning gathering materials, ranging farther from their small camp than he'd dared during the storm. Fallen timber was plentiful this high up, ancient pines brought down by wind and weather, their wood seasoned hard as iron. Jonas selected the straightest pieces he could find, dragging them back to the shelter site with Jasper's help. The gelding seemed to understand the importance of the work, picking his way carefully over the rough ground, while Jonas loaded him with as much timber as the animal could safely carry. The memories came flooding back as Jonas worked, his hands remembering skills he'd learned as a young man working on his father's ranch. How to notch logs so they'd fit together snugly, how to chink the gaps with moss and mud to keep out the wind, how to angle a roof so snow would shed properly instead of accumulating until the whole structure collapsed. He'd built barns and corrals, line shacks and shelters, always with his father's voice in his ear, pointing out the shortcuts that would come back to haunt him later. "Measure twice, cut once," the old man used to say. "A job worth doing is worth doing right the first time." Jonas found himself speaking those same words aloud as he worked, partly for the comfort of familiar phrases, and partly because the horse seemed to enjoy the sound of his voice. The animal watched every movement with keen interest, as if he understood that his survival depended on Jonas's skill with axe and saw. By noon, Jonas had the framework of a proper shelter in place, 4 walls and a slanted roof that would shed rain and snow away from the interior. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, built to last through whatever weather the mountains might throw at them. More importantly, it was sized for a horse, with enough room for the animal to stand and move around once he was strong enough to try. The injured leg remained Jonas's biggest concern. He'd treated plenty of livestock injuries over the years, but always with proper supplies and the luxury of a warm barn to work in. Here, with nothing but his basic trail gear and whatever he could improvise from the surrounding wilderness, every decision carried the weight of life and death. The splint would need changing regularly, and the wound would need cleaning to prevent infection. Jonas had a small bottle of whiskey in his saddlebags, saved for medicinal purposes, though he'd been tempted to drink it often enough during the long winter nights. Now, he was grateful for his restraint. The alcohol would help clean the wound, and if infection set in, it might be the only thing standing between the horse and blood poisoning. As the afternoon wore on, Jonas made his first real attempt at examining the injury. The horse tensed when Jonas approached the damaged leg, but he didn't try to pull away. Trust was building between them, fragile as new ice, but real nonetheless. Jonas spoke in low, soothing tones as he carefully unwrapped the makeshift bandages, prepared for the worst. The damage was severe but not hopeless. The cannon bone appeared to be cracked rather than completely broken, which meant it might heal if properly set and given enough time. The flesh wounds were deep but clean, already showing the first signs of healing around the edges. Most encouraging of all, there was no smell of infection, no telltale heat that would signal the beginning of gangrene. Jonas cleaned the wounds as gently as he could, using melted snow water and small amounts of the precious whiskey. The horse flinched, but held still, seeming to understand that the pain was necessary for healing. When Jonas had done all he could, he fashioned a new splint from pine branches and strips torn from his spare shirt. It was better than the first attempt, more carefully shaped and padded, where it would press against bone and tendon. "There," Jonas said, settling back on his heels, "that should hold you for a few days." The horse lowered his head and blew softly against Jonas's shoulder, a gesture of gratitude that nearly brought tears to the weathered cowboy's eyes. It had been so long since anything had depended on him, since his actions had mattered to another living creature. The responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating. As evening approached, Jonas began to think about food. His own supplies were running low, and the horse would need more than he could forage from the barren mountainside. There was grain in his camp, intended for Jasper, but not nearly enough to keep 2 horses fed through an extended stay. He'd have to ration carefully or make another trip down to Cedar Ridge for supplies. The thought of leaving the horse alone, even for the day it would take to reach town and return, made Jonas's stomach clench with anxiety. In his current weakened state, the animal wouldn't survive another night of exposure if the weather turned bad. But without proper feed and medical supplies, he might not survive anyway. Jonas spent the evening talking through the problem aloud, as much for the horse's benefit as his own. The animal seemed to find comfort in the sound of human conversation, his ears pricking forward whenever Jonas spoke. It reminded Jonas of the hours he'd spent talking to Emma when she was small, explaining the world to her curious questions and watching her face light up with understanding. "We're going to make it through this," Jonas promised, running his hand along the horse's neck as the stars began to appear overhead. "Both of us. I don't know how yet, but we're going to figure it out." The horse nickered softly in response, and Jonas chose to take it as agreement. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make about supplies and treatment, and the growing bond between a broken man and a dying horse. But tonight, They were warm and safe and no longer alone. For the first time in 5 years, that felt like enough. The bottle of carbolic acid felt heavier than it should have in Jonas's saddlebags as he made his way back up the mountain. 3 days had passed since he'd left the horse in the crude shelter, 3 days of worry that ate at him like acid while he gathered supplies in Cedar Ridge. The trip down had been necessary. They needed proper medical supplies, feed, and materials if they were going to have any real chance, but leaving had felt like abandonment all over again. Doc Mackenzie had raised his eyebrows when Jonas requested the carbolic acid, along with proper bandages, antiseptic powder, and enough laudanum to ease severe pain. The old physician was too experienced to ask direct questions, but his weathered face showed concern as he packed the medical supplies with the same care he'd use for any patient. "This is quality medicine," Doc had said, wrapping the bottles in cloth to prevent breakage. "Whatever you're treating up there, you're serious about doing it right." Jonas had nodded, paying in silver coins that represented a significant portion of his remaining money. The expense stung, but the alternative, watching the horse die for lack of proper care, was unthinkable. He'd crossed a line somewhere in those first desperate hours, moving from simple compassion to something deeper and more committed. Mary Sullivan had been equally tactful when Jonas bought grain, oats, and dried apples, in quantities far exceeding what Jasper could consume. Her Irish eyes had shown curiosity, but she'd simply packed everything carefully and wished him safe travels. The kindness of these people, their willingness to help without demanding explanations, reminded Jonas why he'd once believed in the basic goodness of human nature. Father O'Brien had been waiting by Jonas's horse when he emerged from the general store, the young priest's face thoughtful as he took in the loaded saddlebags and the urgency in Jonas's movements. "Looks like you're preparing for something important," the priest had observed. "If you need any help—" "I appreciate the offer, Father," Jonas had cut him off gently, "but this is something I need to handle myself." The priest had nodded, but his parting words followed Jonas up the mountain. "Sometimes the Lord puts opportunities for redemption in our path. The wise man recognizes them when they come." Now, as Jonas approached the shelter he'd built, his heart hammered with anxiety. 3 days was a long time for an injured horse to survive alone, even with the protection he'd provided. The weather had been kind, no major storms, temperatures above the killing point, but anything could have gone wrong. Infection, predators, simple despair could have claimed the animal while Jonas was away. The soft nickering that greeted his approach sent relief flooding through Jonas's chest like warm whiskey. The horse was not only alive but alert, his head raised and ears pricked forward at the sound of Jasper's hoofbeats. When Jonas dismounted and approached the shelter, those dark eyes fixed on him with what could only be described as joy. "Miss me, did you?" Jonas asked, running his hands over the horse's neck and feeling for signs of fever or deterioration. The animal was thinner than when he'd left, but his breathing was steady and his eyes clear. More importantly, the injury showed continued signs of healing, with no telltale smell of infection or heat that would signal serious complications. Jonas spent the next hour cleaning and redressing the wound with his new supplies. The carbolic acid made the horse flinch, but the antiseptic was exactly what was needed to prevent infection from taking hold. The proper bandages were a vast improvement over torn shirt strips, providing better support and protection while allowing the wound to breathe properly. When the medical work was finished, Jonas broke out the grain he'd bought in town. The horse's reaction to the first proper meal he'd had in days was almost heartbreaking, the way he savored each mouthful, the gratitude in his eyes as his body began to receive the nutrition it desperately needed. Jonas found himself talking constantly as the horse ate, sharing observations about the weather, plans for improving the shelter, anything to fill the silence that had surrounded him for so many years. "You're going to need a name," Jonas said, settling down beside the horse as the afternoon light began to fade. "Can't keep calling you big fellow forever." The horse paused in his eating to look at Jonas, as if he understood the importance of the moment. Names had power, Jonas knew. Once you named something, it became real in a way that went beyond simple existence. It became something worth caring about, worth fighting for, worth grieving if it was lost. Jonas thought about the names he'd given to horses over the years, practical names mostly, based on appearance or temperament. Bay, Dusty, Thunder, Midnight. Good names for working animals, but this horse was different. This horse had already proven himself to be a fighter, a survivor against impossible odds. He deserved a name that reflected that strength. "How about Champion?" Jonas suggested, then shook his head. "Too obvious. You've got more class than that." The horse returned to his grain, seemingly content to let Jonas work through the problem aloud. The conversation felt natural in a way that surprised Jonas. He'd grown so accustomed to silence that he'd forgotten how companionable the right kind of talk could be. As the days passed, a routine developed between them. Jonas would wake before dawn to check the horse's condition, change bandages when necessary, and provide fresh water and feed. The mornings were devoted to improving their shelter and gathering firewood for the cold nights. Afternoons were for gentle exercise, short walks around the clearing as the horse's strength returned, careful stretching to prevent the injured leg from stiffening. But it was the evenings that mattered most. With the day's work done and the fire crackling against the mountain cold, Jonas would settle beside the horse and talk about the ranch he'd once run, the cattle he'd raised, the pride he'd taken in honest work well done, about Sarah's laugh and Emma's curiosity, the way their small house had felt like the center of the universe when love filled its rooms. The horse listened to it all with the patience of a priest hearing confession, his presence somehow making it easier for Jonas to speak truths he'd kept buried for 5 long years. There was no judgment in those dark eyes, no disappointment or reproach, just acceptance, and the kind of companionship that asked nothing more than simple presence. One evening, as Jonas was telling the horse about the first colt he'd ever helped deliver, the animal did something unexpected. He lowered his great head and rested it against Jonas's shoulder, breathing softly in the gathering darkness. The gesture was so trusting, so full of gratitude and affection that Jonas felt something crack open in his chest, a place that had been frozen solid since the day he'd buried his family. "You're going to be fine," Jonas whispered, his voice thick with emotion he'd thought, long dead. "We both are." Jonas's father's pocket watch had been keeping perfect time for 43 years, its steady tick-tick-tick, a comforting constant in a world that seemed determined to change everything else. The brass case was worn smooth from decades of handling, and the crystal face bore a spider web of tiny cracks from the day Jonas had dropped it while breaking a particularly stubborn Mustang. But it still ran true. And now it had found new purpose, timing the horse's medication schedule with the precision of a railroad conductor. Every 4 hours, without fail, Jonas would check the watch and prepare another dose of willow bark tea, a natural pain reliever he'd learned to brew from his grandmother's old remedies. The horse had come to anticipate these visits, nickering softly when he heard Jonas stirring near the fire. Trust had deepened between them in ways that went beyond simple gratitude, evolving into something that resembled genuine partnership. 6 weeks had passed since that first desperate night in the makeshift shelter. The crude lean-to had been replaced by a proper 3-sided shed, chinked against the wind and floored with pine boughs that Jonas replaced regularly to keep the space clean and dry. The horse could stand now for extended periods, favoring the injured leg, but bearing weight on it, without the sharp intake of breath that had marked his earlier attempts. More importantly, his personality was beginning to emerge. Jonas discovered that the horse was intelligent beyond the ordinary, with a sense of humor that manifested in gentle pranks, nudging Jonas's hat off his head, while the man was bent over tending the fire, or deliberately stepping on the edge of the water bucket to splash Jonas's boots. These small rebellions delighted Jonas more than he cared to admit. They were signs of spirit returning, of a creature who felt secure enough to play. The transformation wasn't limited to the horse. Jonas caught glimpses of himself in the still water of melted snow and barely recognized the man looking back. His face had filled out somewhat, the hollow-cheeked gauntness of the winter months giving way to something that looked almost healthy. His movements had regained purpose, the aimless drift of a man with nothing to live for, replaced by the focused energy of someone with important work to do. On clear mornings, when the mountain air was thin and bright as crystal, Jonas would sit beside the horse and watch the sun climb over the eastern peaks. These were the times when memories came flooding back, not the painful ones that had driven him into exile, but earlier recollections that carried warmth instead of grief. He remembered teaching Emma to ride on a gentle mare named Buttercup, how his daughter's face had glowed with pride when she'd managed her first solo circuit of the corral. Sarah had watched from the fence, one hand pressed to her heart in maternal anxiety, the other raised in encouragement. Those had been good days, when the future stretched ahead like an open road and anything seemed possible. "She would have loved you," Jonas told the horse one morning, running his hand along the animal's neck. Emma had a way with horses that was pure gift, could calm the wildest bronco just by talking to it. The horse turned his head to look at Jonas, those dark eyes holding an intelligence that seemed almost human. Sometimes Jonas wondered if the animal could sense the sadness that still lived in his chest, the way some creatures seemed able to read emotions that people tried to hide. The practical challenges of their mountain existence had settled into manageable routines. Jonas had learned to ration the grain to make it last longer, supplementing with pine nuts and the tender shoots of new growth that the horse seemed to enjoy. Water was plentiful from snowmelt, and Jonas had rigged a simple collection system that funneled runoff into containers that rarely froze completely, even on the coldest nights. But it was the emotional healing that surprised Jonas most. For 5 years, he'd carried his guilt like a stone in his chest, convinced that he was fundamentally flawed, that his failures had caused the deaths of the people he loved most. The horse's steady recovery, the daily evidence that his care was making a difference, began to chip away at that conviction. Maybe, Jonas thought, watching the horse take his first tentative steps outside the shelter, there were different kinds of failure. Maybe arriving too late with medicine wasn't the same as not caring enough to try. Maybe sometimes the best you could do simply wasn't enough, and that didn't make you a bad man, just a human one. The insight came gradually, like dawn breaking over the mountains. Jonas found himself thinking less about what he'd lost and more about what he still had to give. His hands were still skilled at healing. His patience was still infinite when a creature was in pain. His capacity for love hadn't died with Sarah and Emma. It had just been waiting for something worthy of the gift. One afternoon, while Jonas was mending a section of the shelter that had been damaged by wind, the horse did something extraordinary. Instead of resting in his usual spot, he limped over to where Jonas was working and stood quietly beside him, occasionally nudging tools closer when Jonas needed them. It was the behavior of a partner, not a patient, a sign that the horse considered them a team. "Getting antsy, are you?" Jonas asked, pausing in his work to scratch behind the horse's ears. "Tired of being an invalid?" The horse waffled softly and bumped Jonas's shoulder with his nose, a gesture that had become their version of conversation. Jonas had begun to understand the subtle language of ears and eyes, the different sounds that meant contentment, curiosity, or mild complaint. It was a vocabulary he'd forgotten he possessed, dormant skills awakening after years of disuse. As the weeks passed, Jonas began allowing himself to imagine a future beyond simple survival. The horse was healing well, but he would never be completely sound. The injury would leave him with a permanent limp that would make him unsuitable for hard work. But there were other possibilities. A gentle riding horse for children, perhaps, or a companion animal for someone who understood that perfection was less important than character. The thought of leaving the mountain, of returning to a world of people and responsibilities, both excited and terrified Jonas. He'd grown comfortable with solitude, with the simple rhythms of care and survival that filled his days. But he was beginning to understand that healing, real healing, required more than just tending wounds and providing shelter. It required connection, purpose, the willingness to risk caring about something that could be lost. Looking at the horse, this magnificent creature who'd refused to give up even when abandoned to die, Jonas felt something he'd thought was gone forever. Hope. Not the desperate kind that grasped at impossibilities, but the steady variety that recognized possibility and was willing to work toward it, one careful step at a time. The carved wooden comb had started as a simple piece of pine, whittled during the long evening hours when Jonas's hands needed something to do besides worry. Each tooth had been shaped with painstaking care, smoothed until the wood felt like silk beneath his fingers. It wasn't fancy, just honest craftsmanship, born of necessity and affection, but when Jonas drew it through the horse's mane for the first time, the animal stood perfectly still, as if he understood the tenderness behind the gesture. Spring was showing its face more boldly now, creeping up the mountainside in tentative stages. The snow had begun its retreat, revealing patches of brown earth that steamed in the morning sun. Ice broke free from the creek beds with sounds like distant thunder, and the first hardy wildflowers pushed through the soil with a determination that reminded Jonas of the horse's refusal to surrender. Life, it seemed, was stubborn in all its forms. The horse's recovery had progressed beyond Jonas's most optimistic expectations. The injured leg had healed with a noticeable limp, but the bone had knitted properly and the flesh wounds had closed clean. More importantly, the animal's spirit had returned in full measure. He was alert, curious, and increasingly eager to explore beyond the confines of their small camp. When Jonas worked around the shelter, the horse followed like an oversized dog, investigating everything with the kind of interest that spoke to intelligence and adaptability. But it was during their grooming sessions that Jonas felt the deepest connection. The wooden comb moved through the horse's coat with gentle strokes, removing the tangles and debris of mountain living, while revealing the true magnificence that had been hidden beneath neglect. The horse's coat was developing a shine that caught the light like polished obsidian, and his muscle tone was returning as proper feed and gradual exercise worked their magic. "You were someone's pride and joy once," Jonas said, working carefully around a particularly stubborn knot behind the horse's ears. "Someone who knew quality when they saw it." The horse turned his head to nuzzle Jonas's shoulder, a gesture that had become routine between them. It was a conversation without words, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed during the long weeks of shared survival. Jonas found himself wondering about the horse's history, who had raised him, trained him, loved him, before circumstance led to his abandonment on the mountain. The question brought uncomfortable parallels to Jonas's own situation. He, too, had been abandoned, though by death rather than human cruelty. He, too, had been left to survive alone, carrying wounds that went deeper than flesh and bone. The difference was that the horse had never stopped believing in the possibility of rescue, while Jonas had convinced himself that isolation was what he deserved. One morning, while Jonas was refilling their water containers at the creek, he heard the sound of approaching horses. The hoofbeats were distant but unmistakable, echoing off the canyon walls in a rhythm that spoke of purpose rather than casual travel. Jonas felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. Visitors were rare in this high country, and most who came this far had specific business in mind. He returned to find the horse standing alert, ears pricked forward as he tracked the approaching sounds. There was no fear in the animal's posture, but there was wariness, the kind of caution that came from hard experience with human unpredictability. The rider who emerged from the tree line was elderly, probably past 70, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He wore the collar of a minister, and his mount was a sturdy mule that looked capable of carrying its burden anywhere faith might lead. When he spotted Jonas and the horse, he raised one hand in greeting and approached with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd learned that most problems could be solved with patience and good intentions. "Morning," the stranger called, dismounting with the careful movements of age. "Name's Reverend William Hayes. I've been riding circuit through these mountains for nigh on 30 years, and I don't believe I've seen you before." Jonas introduced himself cautiously, his hand resting on the horse's neck in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. The Reverend's eyes took in the shelter, the careful arrangement of their camp, and the obvious bond between man and animal with the kind of understanding that came from long experience with human nature. "That's a fine horse," Reverend Hayes observed, approaching slowly with his hands visible. "Looks like he's been through some troubles." "Found him half dead in the snow," Jonas replied. "Hunting party abandoned him when he got hurt." The Reverend's expression darkened. "There's a special place in hell for men who treat God's creatures with such callousness." He studied the horse more carefully, his experienced eye taking in the healed injuries and the obvious care that had been invested in the animal's recovery. "You've done remarkable work here. Not many would have taken on such a challenge." Jonas felt heat rise in his cheeks at the praise. He'd grown unaccustomed to approval, to the idea that his actions might be viewed as admirable rather than merely adequate. "Couldn't just leave him to die," he muttered. "No," the Reverend agreed. "You couldn't. That says something important about the kind of man you are, Mr. Cutter." They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation meandering through topics as varied as mountain weather, the challenges of frontier ministry, and the peculiar bond that could develop between humans and animals. The Reverend shared stories of other rescues he'd witnessed: a settler who'd nursed an injured wolf back to health, a widow who'd raised an orphaned bear cub, tales of compassion that bridged the gap between species. "God works in mysterious ways," Reverend Hayes said as he prepared to continue his journey. "Sometimes he puts opportunities for redemption right in our path, and the wise man recognizes them when they come." The words echoed Father O'Brien's earlier observation, and Jonas found himself wondering if there was more design to his situation than simple chance. The horse had appeared when Jonas needed purpose most desperately. The skills necessary for the animal's care had emerged from buried memories just when they were required. Even the supplies and shelter materials had been readily available, as if the mountain itself was conspiring to make their survival possible. After the Reverend departed, Jonas spent the afternoon in quiet contemplation, the wooden comb moving through the horse's mane in long, meditative strokes. The animal stood patiently, seeming to understand that his human companion was working through something important. As evening approached and Jonas prepared their simple meal, he found himself thinking about the Reverend's words regarding redemption. For months, he'd focused on saving the horse's life, pouring all his energy into the practical challenges of healing and survival. But perhaps the real miracle wasn't that the horse had lived. It was that Jonas had remembered how to hope again, how to care about something beyond his own pain. Looking at the horse, seeing the trust in those dark eyes and the contentment in his relaxed posture, Jonas realized that salvation had indeed come in an unexpected form. Not the dramatic rescue he'd once imagined, but the quiet daily choice to keep trying, to keep caring, to keep believing that broken things could be made whole again. The silver-inlaid bridle was tangled deep in the horse's mane, so thoroughly embedded that Jonas almost missed it entirely. He'd been working the wooden comb through a particularly stubborn knot when his fingers encountered something hard and smooth beneath the coarse hair. At first he thought it was a burr or piece of bark, but as he worked it free, the morning sunlight caught the gleam of polished silver and stopped his heart cold. The bridle was exquisite, far too fine for the rough mountain country where he'd found the horse. The leather was soft and supple despite its ordeal, dyed a rich brown that spoke of quality craftsmanship. But it was the silver conchas that made Jonas's hands tremble as he turned the piece over in his palm. Each one was hand-engraved with delicate scrollwork, and on the largest piece, Near what would have been the cheek strap, an inscription caught the light. For Emma from Papa. Christmas 1880. The world tilted sideways. Jonas felt his knees buckle, and he barely managed to catch himself against the horse's shoulder as the implications crashed over him like an avalanche. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. The bridle he held in his shaking hands was one he'd commissioned himself 6 years ago, a special gift for his daughter's 8th Christmas, the last Christmas they'd all shared together before the fever came. The horse, this magnificent animal he'd been nursing back to health, was Star, Emma's Star. Memories flooded back with devastating clarity. The months of saving money for the perfect gift. The long discussions with the leatherworker about every detail of the bridle's design. Emma's face on Christmas morning when she'd unwrapped the package, her squeal of delight when she realized what it meant that she was finally old enough, responsible enough, to have her own proper riding gear. Star had been a yearling then, all legs and spirit, purchased from a breeder in Denver who specialized in horses with the bloodlines and temperament suitable for a child. Jonas had spent weeks gentling the young animal, teaching him to accept a halter, to lead quietly, to stand for grooming. Emma had been there for every lesson, her small hands learning to brush and curry, her voice soft with the kind of love that only children could give so freely. "He's the most beautiful horse in the whole world, Papa," she'd said, standing on a wooden crate to reach Star's back with the brush. "When I'm grown up, we're going to ride all the way to California together." The fever had taken her 3 months later. Jonas had sold Star along with everything else, unable to bear the constant reminders of dreams that would never be fulfilled. He'd told himself it was practical. A grieving widower had no use for a child's riding horse, but the truth was simpler and more painful. Every time he looked at Star, he saw Emma's face shining with joy, heard her voice planning adventures they'd never take. Now, 6 years later, Star had come back to him. Not the gangly yearling Emma had adored, but a mature stallion in his prime, bearing the scars of hard use and abandonment. The hunters who'd left him to die probably had no idea of his history, wouldn't have cared if they did. To them, he was just another pack animal, useful until he wasn't, disposable when he became a burden. But Jonas knew better. Looking into those dark eyes that had watched him with such trust and gratitude, he saw something that made his chest ache with a pain deeper than any physical wound. Star remembered him. Maybe not consciously, horses didn't work that way, but somewhere in the animal's instincts was the memory of gentle hands and patient training, of a time when humans meant safety and care instead of abandonment and cruelty. Jonas sank to his knees in the snow, the silver bridle clutched against his chest as 6 years of suppressed grief finally found its voice. He wept for Emma, for the rides they'd never taken, and the woman she'd never become. He wept for Sarah, who died before she could see her daughter grow up to fulfill all that bright promise. And he wept for himself, for the years he'd spent convinced that their deaths were somehow his fault, that he'd failed them in some fundamental way that made him unworthy of happiness. Star lowered his great head and nuzzled Jonas's shoulder, the same gentle gesture he'd offered during their weeks together on the mountain. But now it carried new meaning, a communication that transcended the boundaries between species. The horse seemed to understand that something profound had shifted, that the man who'd saved his life was drowning in revelation and needed anchoring. The pieces fell into place with awful clarity, Star's immediate trust despite his abandonment. The way he'd responded to Jonas's voice and touch, as if remembering something from long ago, his unusual intelligence and the almost human understanding in his eyes. This wasn't just any horse Jonas had rescued, it was Emma's horse, returned to him by whatever force controlled the seemingly random movements of the universe. Jonas had never been a particularly religious man, but sitting there in the snow with Star's warm breath on his neck and Emma's bridle in his hands, he found it impossible to dismiss the idea of divine intervention. What were the odds that of all the horses in Colorado territory, the one he'd find dying on a remote mountain peak would be the animal he'd bought for his daughter? What were the chances that Star would have survived 6 years of unknown ownership, only to be abandoned in the exact place where Jonas could find him? The rational part of his mind offered explanations: coincidence, the natural movement of livestock through trading networks, the simple fact that good horses changed hands frequently in frontier territory. But his heart, the part of him that had been frozen solid since Emma's death, whispered a different truth. This was Emma's gift to him, her way of telling her papa that love didn't end with death, that some bonds were strong enough to transcend the boundaries between life and whatever came after. As the day wore on, Jonas found himself remembering details about Star that he'd somehow forgotten or refused to acknowledge. The way the horse tilted his head when listening intently. His habit of lipping at Jonas's pocket, looking for treats the way he'd done as a yearling when Emma carried sugar cubes in her pinafore. The particular sound of his nickering, a tone Jonas now realized he'd heard in dreams for years without understanding its significance. That evening, as they sat by the fire with Star's head resting companionably against Jonas's shoulder, the full weight of his responsibility settled over him like a mantle. This wasn't just about saving an injured horse anymore. This was about honoring Emma's memory, about proving himself worthy of the trust a little girl had placed in him so many years ago when she'd asked him to take care of her most precious possession. Star had been abandoned once, cast aside when he was no longer useful, but he would never be abandoned again. Jonas would see to that. Whatever it took, wherever it led, he would make sure that Emma's horse, his horse, now lived out his days, knowing that he was valued, cherished, and safe. The silver bridle caught the firelight as Jonas set it carefully aside, its engravings glowing like captured starlight. Tomorrow he would clean and oil the leather, restore it to something approaching its original beauty. But tonight he simply sat with Star and marveled at the mysterious ways that broken souls found their way back to each other, carrying messages of love across the vast distances that separated the living from the lost. Emma's small leather journal was tucked deep in the bridle's saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it through years of weather and neglect. Jonas's hands shook as he unfolded the covering, revealing the worn notebook with its careful child's writing and pencil sketches that brought his daughter back to life on the yellowed pages. The first entry was dated December 26th, 1880, the day after Christmas, when Emma had received Star and the beautiful bridle Jonas now held with reverent care. "Dear Diary," the entry began in Emma's careful script. "Today was the best day of my whole life. Papa gave me my very own horse. His name is Star because he has a white mark on his forehead that looks just like the Christmas star. He's so beautiful and gentle, and when I whisper in his ear, I think he understands everything I say." Jonas had to stop reading as emotion threatened to overwhelm him. That white star marking had faded with age, barely visible now beneath Star's dark forelock. But Jonas remembered how Emma had traced it with her finger while naming her new companion. She'd been so proud, so confident, that she and Star were destined for great adventures together. Page after page revealed Emma's growing relationship with the young horse. Sketches showed Star learning to accept a saddle, his first tentative steps under Emma's light weight, the joy on both their faces as confidence grew between them. Emma's writing revealed her plans for their future, how they would explore the mountains together, how Star would carry her to school when she was older, how they would ride in the 4th of July parade with ribbons braided in his mane. "Star understands everything," one entry proclaimed. "When I'm sad about Mama's cough, he lets me cry against his neck and doesn't try to move away. He's the best friend a girl could have, and I love him more than anything except Papa and Mama." The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before the typhoid struck, when the world still seemed full of infinite possibility. "Papa says, I'm getting good enough to ride Star by myself this spring. I can hardly wait." We're going to ride all the way to the meadow where the Indian paintbrush grows, and I'm going to pick flowers for Mama's table. Star's getting so strong and handsome. Papa says he's going to be the finest horse in the whole territory, and he'll be mine forever and always. Forever and always. The words hit Jonas like a physical blow, carrying the weight of promises that death had seemed to break. But perhaps death wasn't as final as he'd believed. Perhaps love really was stronger than the grave, and Emma's forever and always had simply taken a form he hadn't expected to recognize. Jonas spent the morning reading every word, studying every sketch, absorbing the pure joy that radiated from his daughter's carefully recorded thoughts. Here was Emma, as he'd known her, curious, loving, utterly convinced that the world was full of wonders waiting to be discovered. Her love for Star shone through every entry, a testament to the bond between child and horse that had transcended death to bring them back together. But the journal also revealed something else that made Jonas's chest tighten with new understanding. Emma had been worried about her mother's persistent cough, the fatigue that Sarah tried to hide but couldn't quite manage. The child's intuition had picked up on signs that the adults had dismissed or explained away. She'd known, on some level, that her family was more fragile than it appeared. I asked Papa if Mama is sick, and he said she's just tired from the long winter. One entry read, "But Star and I think she needs more rest. We're going to help by being extra quiet when she's sleeping." Jonas remembered that conversation, remembered brushing off Emma's concerns with the casual dismissal of an adult who thought he understood more than a child. If he'd listened, if he'd paid attention to what Emma was trying to tell him, would things have been different? Could he have gotten medical help for Sarah before the typhoid took hold? The questions tormented him as he carefully returned the journal to its oilcloth wrapping. But mixed with the old guilt was something new, a sense of wonder at the way love had found a way to persist, despite everything. Emma's words lived on in these pages, her affection for Star preserved in fading pencil marks that somehow felt more real than memory. As the days passed, Jonas threw himself into preparing Star for the journey down from the mountain. The horse's recovery was essentially complete. He would always carry a slight limp, but he was strong enough to travel and eager to explore beyond their small sanctuary. More importantly, Jonas had made a decision that felt like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. They were going home, not to the ranch that was sold and gone, part of a past he couldn't reclaim, but to Cedar Ridge, to the community that had sustained him through his darkest hours without asking for anything in return. Doc Mackenzie deserved to see the results of his medical supplies. Mary Sullivan should know that her kindness had contributed to something miraculous. Father O'Brien might find comfort in learning that redemption really could arrive on 4 legs, just as he'd suggested. Jonas spent hours each day working with Star, not just maintaining his recovery, but beginning the process of retraining him for life in civilization. The horse had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythms of mountain life, but he would need to remember how to navigate crowds, carriages, and the general chaos of a frontier town. Fortunately, Star's early training under Jonas's careful hands had laid a foundation that years of hard use hadn't completely erased. The rehabilitation was as much about Jonas as it was about Star. For months, their world had consisted of just the two of them and the elemental challenges of survival. Now Jonas had to prepare himself for human interaction, for the questions and curiosity that would inevitably come when he appeared in Cedar Ridge with a horse that clearly represented a significant investment of time and care. But there was something else driving his preparations, a growing sense of urgency that had nothing to do with practical concerns. Jonas had begun to feel as though his time on the mountain was meant to end, that the healing process for both man and horse was approaching completion. They had saved each other in ways that went beyond mere physical survival. Now it was time to discover what came next. The decision of what to do with Star once they reached Cedar Ridge remained unresolved. Jonas's heart wanted to keep the horse, to honor Emma's memory by ensuring her beloved companion lived out his days in comfort and safety. But his practical mind recognized the challenges. He had little money left after months of expensive medical supplies and feed. He had no property, no stable income, no clear plan for the future beyond the simple desire to rejoin the human community he'd abandoned. More troubling were the legal questions that nagged at the edges of his consciousness. Star had been sold 6 years ago, passed through unknown hands before ending up with the hunting party that had abandoned him. Did Jonas have any legitimate claim to the horse, or was he simply a temporary caretaker who would eventually have to surrender Emma's companion to whoever held proper ownership papers? The thought of losing Star again, of watching him disappear into an uncertain future with strangers who might not understand his gentle nature or unique history, made Jonas's stomach clench with familiar anxiety. He'd found his daughter's horse against impossible odds. The idea of losing him to legal technicalities or financial necessity felt like a betrayal of the miracle that had brought them together. As Jonas brushed Star's gleaming coat and checked his tack for the journey ahead, he found himself thinking about the hunting party that had left the horse to die. They were still out there somewhere, probably back in whatever town they called home, completely unaware that their abandoned pack animal had survived. Did they even remember leaving him behind, or was Star just another piece of equipment discarded when it became inconvenient? The questions would need answers, and soon. But first, Jonas had to get Star safely off the mountain and into the care that only civilization could provide. The horse deserved better than a crude shelter and whatever medical attention Jonas could improvise from wilderness remedies. He deserved a warm, stable, proper veterinary care and the kind of security that only money and legal standing could guarantee. Standing in the evening light with Star's head resting against his shoulder, Jonas made a silent promise to the ghost of his daughter. Whatever it took, whoever stood in his way, he would make sure that Star never suffered abandonment again. Emma's horse, his horse now, would live out his days, knowing that he was valued, protected, and loved. The mountain had given them time to heal, but the real test lay ahead in the world below, where human nature and legal complications would determine whether their bond could survive the transition from wilderness sanctuary to civilized society. Jonas's old Colt revolver felt foreign in his hand after years of disuse, its weight a reminder of a younger man who'd believed that some problems could be solved with violence. The weapon had belonged to his father, carried through the war and countless frontier disputes, but Jonas had hoped never to draw it in anger again. Now, as the sound of approaching horses echoed through the mountain air, he checked the cylinder with practiced efficiency and slipped the gun back into its holster. The hunting party emerged from the tree line just after noon, 4 men on horseback moving with the confident swagger of those accustomed to taking what they wanted. Their leader was a big man, with a dark beard and eyes that missed nothing, the kind of individual who made his living in the gray areas where law and order grew thin. Behind him rode 3 younger men, probably hired hands, who followed orders without asking uncomfortable questions about right and wrong. "Well, well," the leader called out as he spotted Jonas and Star near the rebuilt shelter. "Looks like we found our missing property." Jonas stepped protectively in front of Star, one hand resting on the horse's neck in a gesture that was both calming and possessive. The animal tensed at the sight of the strangers, his ears laid back and nostrils flaring as he caught their scent. Whatever memories Star carried from his time with these men, they weren't pleasant ones. "This horse was abandoned," Jonas said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that often preceded violence. "Left to die in a blizzard with a broken leg and no feed. That makes him mine by right of salvage." The bearded man laughed, a sound devoid of humor that made Star sidestep nervously. "That's not how the law works, old-timer. We got papers that say different." He patted his saddlebags significantly. "Bought and paid for, all legal-like." Legal doesn't mean right, Jonas replied. You left him to freeze and starve. What kind of men do that to an animal that served them faithfully? The practical kind, the leader said, dismounting with deliberate slowness. Horse went lame, couldn't carry his load. We had supplies to get down the mountain before the next storm hit. Sometimes you got to make hard choices. Jonas felt anger building in his chest like steam in a boiler, the kind of rage he hadn't experienced since the day he'd buried his family. These men spoke of Star as if he were nothing more than a piece of equipment, a tool to be discarded when it stopped being useful. They had no understanding of the bond between human and animal, no comprehension of the trust they'd violated when they left him to die alone. Hard choices, Jonas repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting, like the choice I'm making right now. The leader's hand moved toward his gun, but Jonas was already drawing, muscle memory from decades of frontier life, serving him well, despite his age. The Colt appeared in his hand with fluid grace, its barrel centered on the big man's chest before any of the hunting party could react. "Easy there, old-timer," the leader said, raising his hand slightly but keeping his voice steady. "No need for this to get ugly. We just want our horse back." "His name is Star," Jonas said, never taking his eyes off the leader while tracking the movements of the other three men with his peripheral vision. "And he's not your horse anymore. You gave up any claim to him when you left him to die." Star moved closer to Jonas, pressing his shoulder against the man's back in a gesture of solidarity that wasn't lost on the hunting party. The horse's loyalty was obvious, his willingness to stand with Jonas against his former tormentors, speaking volumes about the treatment he'd received. "That animal's worth more than you probably see in 5 years, the leader said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You think we're just going to ride away and let some broken-down hermit steal our property?" "I think you're going to do exactly that," Jonas replied, "unless you're prepared to die for a horse you already threw away once." The tension stretched between them like a wire ready to snap. 4 armed men facing one elderly cowboy and his horse in a mountain clearing where no law existed except what they made themselves. Jonas could see the calculations running behind the leader's eyes, the odds, the potential profit, the risk of violence against an old man who might be more dangerous than he appeared. Star whinnied softly, a sound that cut through the hostile silence like a prayer. In that moment, Jonas felt Emma's presence, as surely as if she was standing beside him, her small hand resting on his arm, the way it had when she was frightened. She was counting on him to protect her horse, to prove that some bonds were stronger than legal documents or the threat of violence. "Your choice," Jonas said, his thumb moving to cock the hammer of the Colt, "but choose fast, because my patience is about worn thin." The leader's hand inched toward his gun, and Jonas knew that the next few seconds would determine whether Star lived free or died defending the man who'd saved his life. The bullet-scarred pine tree would stand as witness to what happened next, its bark splintered by wild shots that spoke more of panic than precision. The gunfight erupted when the leader's patience finally snapped, his hand darting for his weapon with the desperate speed of a man who'd mistaken an old cowboy's resolve for weakness. Jonas's first shot took the leader in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying into the snow. The Colt bucked in Jonas's hand like a living thing, 40 years of frontier experience guiding his aim, even as his conscious mind struggled to process the sudden explosion of violence. Star reared behind him, striking out with iron-shod hooves at one of the younger men who'd been foolish enough to approach too close. The other 3 hunters scrambled for cover behind their horses, their own weapons drawn, but their shots wild and poorly aimed. Jonas had chosen his position well, the shelter at his back and clear fields of fire in 3 directions. More importantly, he had something they lacked, absolute conviction that he was fighting for something worth dying for. "Stop!" The wounded leader gasped from where he'd fallen, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. "For God's sake, stop shooting!" Jonas kept his revolver trained on the nearest hunter, a young man with fear written across his face who'd probably never been in a real gunfight before. "Tell your boys to put their guns down," Jonas called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "This doesn't have to get any worse." The leader struggled to sit up, his face pale with pain and shock. Whatever he'd expected when he'd come to reclaim his property, it hadn't been resistance from a man who'd found something worth fighting for. "You shot me," he said, as if the fact surprised him more than it hurt. "Warning shot," Jonas replied grimly. "Next one won't be." Star had calmed somewhat but remained alert, his ears swiveling to track every movement from the hunters. The horse's trust in Jonas was absolute. If his human said fight, then they'd fight together. If Jonas said these men were enemies, then Star would treat them accordingly. The wounded leader looked at his men, saw the uncertainty in their faces, and seemed to reach some internal conclusion. "Put them down," he ordered wearily. "All of you, put the guns down." One by one, the hunters lowered their weapons, their earlier swagger replaced by the kind of caution that came from realizing they'd bitten off more than they could chew. The young man closest to Jonas was shaking visibly, probably wondering how a simple horse recovery had turned into a shooting match. Jonas approached the wounded leader slowly, keeping his gun ready but no longer aimed directly at the man's chest. Up close, he could see that the shoulder wound was painful but not life-threatening. The bullet had passed clean through without hitting bone or major blood vessels. "You need that tended to," Jonas said, his voice carrying none of the hostility that had marked their earlier exchange. "I've got medical supplies." The leader stared at him in amazement. "You shoot me and then offer to patch me up?" "I'm not a killer," Jonas replied. "Just a man protecting what's his." As Jonas worked to clean and bandage the wound, using skills learned from months of caring for Star's injuries, an unexpected conversation began to develop. The leader, whose name turned out to be Frank Morrison, found himself grudgingly impressed by both Jonas's marksmanship and his subsequent mercy. "That's some horse you got there," Morrison admitted, watching Star stand guard nearby. "Never seen an animal so devoted to a man." "We've been through a lot together," Jonas said, wrapping the bandage with careful precision. "He knows I won't abandon him." Morrison winced as Jonas tightened the dressing, but his eyes never left Star. The horse's magnificent presence was undeniable, even to men who'd treated him as mere cargo. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that? Most men your age, their hands shake too much for accuracy." "Had good teachers," Jonas replied, "and good reasons to remember what they taught me." As the immediate crisis passed and weapons were holstered, Morrison began to see the situation with clearer eyes. The devotion between man and horse was obvious, the care that had gone into Star's recovery evident in every line of his restored health. This wasn't just a matter of stolen property, it was something deeper, more personal. "You really found him half dead?" Morrison asked. Jonas nodded, his hand moving to rest on Star's neck. "Broken leg, half frozen, abandoned in a blizzard. Took months to bring him back." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the horse with new understanding. Finally, he reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a folded paper, the bill of sale he'd mentioned earlier. Without a word, he tore it in half and let the pieces fall into the snow. "Consider our debt paid," he said quietly, "for the doctoring and for proving that some men are better than others." Jonas felt something ease in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "You could have just put him out of his misery," he said. "Would have been kinder than leaving him to suffer." "Yeah," Morrison agreed, shame coloring his voice. "We could have, should have. That's something I'll have to live with." The bullet-scarred pine would indeed stand as a monument to the moment Jonas chose love over loss, action over regret. But it would also mark the place where mercy triumphed over vengeance, and where one man's recognition of his own failures paved the way for another man's redemption. The new horseshoe gleamed like polished silver in the morning light, each nail hole perfectly placed by Cedar Ridge's skilled blacksmith who'd taken special care with this particular commission. Father O'Brien had insisted on blessing the shoe before it was fitted, his young hands steady as he traced the sign of the cross over the iron while murmuring words about safe journeys and divine protection. It was a small ceremony, but one that seemed fitting for a horse who'd traveled so far through darkness to find his way home. Jonas stood in the doorway of what had once been the livery stable, watching Star explore his new surroundings with the careful curiosity of an animal learning to trust again. The building had been empty for 2 years, its previous owner having moved west to California, but Jonas had managed to purchase it with the small inheritance he'd never touched, money that had sat in the Cedar Ridge bank, gathering dust while he wandered the mountains in exile. 6 months had passed since their dramatic confrontation with Morrison's hunting party, 6 months of slow integration back into the rhythms of civilized life. The transition hadn't been easy for either man or horse. Star had needed time to adjust to the sounds and smells of town life, while Jonas had struggled with the constant presence of other people after years of solitude. But gradually, both had found their place in the small community that had welcomed them back with open arms. Doc Mackenzie had been the first to visit when word spread that Jonas Cutter had returned with a magnificent horse-bearing scars that spoke of a remarkable survival story. The old physician had examined Star with professional thoroughness, marveling at the quality of care that had gone into healing such severe injuries. "You did extraordinary work up there," Doc had said, running his hands along Star's leg where the bones had knitted cleanly, despite the primitive conditions. "This animal should have died, but you brought him back better than new." Mary Sullivan had appeared the next day with a basket of food and the kind of fierce maternal concern that brooked no argument. She'd taken one look at Jonas, still thin from months of mountain living, but somehow more solid, more present than the broken man who'd ridden away 5 years earlier, and declared that he needed proper feeding and regular human contact. "You've got color in your cheeks again," she'd observed with satisfaction. "And your eyes don't look through people anymore. That horse has been good medicine for you." Jonas Cutter. But it was Father O'Brien who'd provided the insight that helped Jonas understand what had really happened during those months on the mountain. The young priest had listened without judgment as Jonas told the full story: Emma's bridal, the journal, the miraculous reunion with his daughter's beloved horse. Some would call it coincidence. Father O'Brien had said thoughtfully, "But I prefer to think of it as grace. Sometimes God's mercy comes in forms we don't expect, through channels we never imagined possible." The stable was modest but well appointed, with 2 large stalls, a tack room, and space for storing feed and equipment. Jonas had plans to expand it eventually, to create a proper facility for helping other animals in need. Word was already spreading through the territory about the man who'd nursed a dying horse back to health, and people were beginning to bring him their own wounded creatures. Just last week, a young widow named Catherine Walsh had arrived with her son's injured dog, tears streaming down her face as she explained that the veterinary doctor in Denver was too expensive and too far away. Jonas had examined the animal, a leg broken in 3 places, and told her to come back in 6 weeks. When she'd asked about payment, he'd simply said that some debts were paid forward rather than back. Star's transformation was complete now, his coat gleaming with health and his bearing proud as any cavalry mount. The limp remained, would always remain, but it didn't seem to diminish his dignity or his obvious joy in being useful again. Jonas had begun taking him on gentle rides around the valley, and Star's delight in the exercise was evident in every step. Children had begun gathering at the stable's fence, drawn by Star's patient nature and the stories that surrounded his rescue. Jonas found himself teaching them about proper horse care, watching their faces light up with the same wonder Emma had shown so many years ago. One boy in particular, an orphan named Timothy who lived with the minister's family, showed a natural aptitude for working with animals that reminded Jonas powerfully of his younger self. "Can you teach me to be like you?" Timothy had asked one afternoon, his small hands gentle as he helped brush Star's coat. "Can you show me how to fix hurt animals?" Jonas had looked into the boy's eager face and seen possibilities he'd thought were lost forever. "It's not easy work," he'd warned. "Takes patience and learning, and sometimes you lose them despite everything you do. But sometimes you save them," Timothy had replied with the certainty of youth, "like you saved Star." "Yes," Jonas thought, "sometimes you saved them. And sometimes, in the saving, you discovered that broken things could indeed be made whole again, not the same as they were before, but something new and perhaps even stronger." The evening routine had become sacred to both man and horse. As the sun set behind the mountains that had sheltered them through their healing, Jonas would sit beside Star's stall and read aloud from Emma's journal. The words never lost their power to move him, but the pain had transformed into something gentler gratitude for the time they'd had together, pride in the woman she would have become, peace in knowing that love really could transcend the boundaries between life and death. "Thank you," Jonas whispered into Star's ear, as he had every night since discovering the truth. "Thank you for coming back to me. Thank you for showing me the way home." Star nickered softly in response, his warm breath stirring Jonas's hair as they stood together in the golden light of another day's end. Outside, Cedar Ridge settled into the comfortable rhythms of evening. Children called in for supper, shopkeepers closing their doors, neighbors sharing the small news that held communities together. Sometimes the most broken souls found each other in the most unlikely places. Sometimes redemption came on four legs, carrying messages of love across distances that seemed impossible to bridge. And sometimes, if a man was very lucky and very grateful, he got the chance to discover that the end of one story was really just the beginning of another.